Hello and welcome back to reaDIYsteaDIY. If it's your first time here, thank you for joining us. If you've already subscribed, thank you for subscribing. Well, this week I want to talk about the Microjig Grr-ripper. Last week I did a video about how to put it together. This week I'd like to talk about what it's like to use. If you're wondering about what the Microjig Grr-ripper is, Microjig Grr-ripper is basically a fancy push block blade guard combination. It's primarily designed for making rip cuts on a table saw, but you can use it with other tools. When you use it on a table saw, it carries both the keeper piece and the offcut piece through the whole cut, and according to Microjig, that reduces the risk of kickback, burning, or wandering during your cut. I'm a beginning woodworker like a lot of you. I'm just looking for a safe way to use my table saw and cut small pieces of wood. The Grr-ripper looked like a good choice for that, so I picked one up, and this week I did a project with it. I have some thoughts. There are some pluses to the tool. There are some minuses to the tool. This week we're gonna go over all of that, and if you're considering the Microjig Grr-ripper, hopefully at the end you'll know if it's for you. So all that said, let's get going. Well, a table saw is a pretty dangerous tool, and it's dangerous because it doesn't work like other circular saws. Other circular saws, your hand's on the saw, you push the saw through the material you're trying to cut. With a table saw, it works the other way around. The saw doesn't move, and you manipulate the material through it. There's a number of things that can go wrong in that process. Obviously, pushing something towards a blade means you're vulnerable to cutting yourself on that blade. While you're pushing the wood through, it can twist over, get caught up in the back teeth, hurtling the piece of wood at you at a tremendous speed. So there's a couple of ways a table saw can really hurt you. But the flip side of that is there's a number of things a table saw can do in terms of cutting wood that other saws just can't. It's a very useful tool. I got my first table saw about a year ago. I had a discussion with Jason Barnes of Alaire Homes. He's been around a lot of table saws. We had a safety discussion about how I could safely use it. I'll put a link to that for you here if you'd like to check it out. So when you're starting out using your table saw, it can be rather overwhelming looking at all the different ways you can push material through your table saw. There's a lot of different opinions about the best way to push wood through a table saw. Push sticks are good and they generally come with your table saw. But while they keep your hands far away from the blade, oftentimes they make it more difficult to control the material. So because of that, people often turn to something like a push shoe, which sits on top of your material and has a little tab at the back, sort of shoves your material through from behind. That gives you more control over the wood that you're cutting. The problem is as you cut the wood into two pieces, that particular style of push stick can't control one of those pieces. It'll control the piece it's sitting on, but the offcut piece usually isn't getting controlled by anything. So enter the Microjig Grr-ripper. The Microjig Grr-ripper is essentially a very fancy push block. It has one difference from traditional push blocks or push sticks though, because it's designed to create a channel that passes over your saw blade as you're feeding material through the table saw. The idea being that because it's basically a bridge that bridges your blade, it takes the place of your blade guard, protects your hand, but also, as the wood passes through the table saw, changing from being one piece of wood to being two pieces of wood, a keeper and an offcut piece, it can control not only the wood when it's one piece, but also when it becomes two. The company claims that this mitigates against kickback, all the while keeping your hand safe because effectively it is a blade guard. So Microjig feels like this tool makes using a table saw much safer. They put it right on the top of the box. Don't use a table saw without one. So how does it work? I would say the process is pretty simple, though a little fiddly. Basically, you set up your saw blade to the right height, you put your fence in the right position to cut the piece of wood you want to cut. All of this is pretty standard. You would do this cutting any piece of wood with any push stick or push block. Once you've done all that, you're ready to get out the Grr-ripper, and basically you're creating a small tunnel that's going to ride over the top of your saw blade. Now that you've got your blade height all set up, you can put the Grr-ripper on top of your material, push it up against the fence so it's all lined up as it will be when you make the cut. You can look down the tunnel that's there and see if it's gonna clear. If you're concerned about clearance, then you just undo the center leg, just undo the two knobs and move it into a position that's gonna more optimally control and make contact with your material, but still leave room for the saw blade to pass through. In theory, it's pretty simple. Once it's all lined up and I've eyeballed it and I'm confident that the tunnel is gonna pass over the blade, turn on the blade and push forward. It's pretty simple. The Grr-ripper gives you real control over the material. It's very easy to make sure that the material stays close to the fence, stays flat while it's passing through the blade, and continues moving forward in a really smooth motion. I'm a beginning woodworker, as you know. The smooth motion part, burning your material, that kind of thing is something beginners always do. I find that with the Grr-ripper, I can overcome that pretty easily. A lot of the cuts that I've been making since I got the Grr-ripper are tremendously improved. I would say in general, the Grr-ripper does what it's advertised to do. It keeps control over the material. It allows you to put forward force, inward force, and it allows you to keep your material flat on the table saw while you're cutting your piece of wood. There are some downsides to it too. some things I didn't think about before I purchased. So the first downside is you got to take off your blade guard. There's just no way around it. It can't be on there and use the gripper at the same time. That's a crying shame. I was really getting attached to my blade guard. I know a lot of you guys take them off. You just don't believe in them, but I really liked the blade guard. Mine had some pawls on the back of it that helped mitigate against kickback. I really liked it. And it felt a little weird taking it off. I'm not going to lie. But the folks at Microjig would tell you that a Microjig gripper basically is a blade guard, sort of takes the place of it. So as long as you're comfortable thinking that way, it's probably going to work for you. I found it a little bit difficult to get used to, but it does feel a little weird having my hand this close to my now moving blade guard. So that's drawback number 1. Drawback number 2, there is a point at which you have passed your material fully through the blade, at which your forearm is directly above the still spinning blade, inches below you. This is not a good feeling. I can't tell you. I know that nothing's gonna happen here. There's a good 6-8 inches between my forearm and that spinning blade. But I just don't like this vulnerable feeling that I get when I use the gripper and I've extended fully and the piece is basically cut and I'm reaching down to turn the blade off before I release. That moment does not feel good. Before you buy, you should make sure that you're comfortable with that, because that was one thing that I really had to get used to. One more downside, the gripper relies on grip. Regardless of where you put the feet, the gripper relies on grip. All 3 feet, and even the extras that you can buy, as all have the same rubber on the bottom, and that rubber gets dirty. I would say after my 20th cut with my gripper, it was dirty enough to slip. I was a little upset about that. I contacted the company. I talked to one of the sales reps there. He owns one. He uses his table saw a lot. He had some good things to say. Basically what the company says is you should get some isopropyl alcohol. They recommend 91%. When I asked them about the percentage, they said it doesn't really matter. And the recommendation was just keep a spray bottle of it around. The minute you start to feel your gripper slipping, give it a spray, give it a wipe, get the dirt off there, it'll grip again. I gotta say, for the most part, I found that true, but it does mean you've got this extra thing you gotta have around the table saw. There really isn't a way, I think, to use a gripper if you don't have some method of cleaning it. You're gonna have to have a spray bottle of isopropyl handy. There's just no way around it. And then I guess the last big knock on the gripper is its cost. It's plastic. It's well-built plastic, I'll give you that, but it is pretty expensive for what it is. But I'll tell you, any tool that allows me to make a 1/4-inch cut on my table saw and feel confident while it's happening, that's a useful tool to me. I don't care what it costs. While I mentioned I felt a little bit iffy having the blade spinning under my forearm, and that's still true, on the whole, the feeling I get while cutting with the gripper is confidence. I feel more confident making cuts with it than I did when I was using push sticks. And that's a big deal. I find that when I feel more confident when I'm doing something, I do it better. It's a pretty good device. And one last thing you should know about before purchasing, they recommend anything over 16 inches, you get 2. So that's a real commitment. So you want to think about that before you make the commitment on 1. But I'll tell you, in the end, I really like my gripper. With all the hassles, with having to set it up and fiddle around with the knobs and get it all safe, when I'm making the cuts, and I don't make a lot of cuts, like I don't use my table saw every day, so I have a different need than someone who is doing it for a living. But I'll tell you, when I cut wood now, I cut it with much more confidence, and the cuts I'm getting are way better. I don't feel less safe. In the beginning, it took some getting used to having my forearm over that spinning blade, as I mentioned, but I'm kind of used to it now and I feel pretty confident using the gripper. So is it the be-all and the end-all tool for everybody? I don't know. It's a little fiddly. It will slow you down. If you're a professional and you got to cut a lot of wood really quickly, it might not be the tool for you. It will definitely make it slower. And if that means you end up not using it, it's obviously not a good safety device. But for me as a beginner who doesn't cut a lot of wood, I like that it makes me slow down. I need to think about the cut before I proceed. It's really helpful, actually, to create my little tunnel and then maybe drop down the stabilizing leg and sort of look at it and size it up and think about where my hand is gonna be, where my arm is gonna be. All those things are really useful to a beginner. So for me, I find it's really useful as a tool. I'm gonna keep it around, but I can see how a professional who already has a method of managing things probably wouldn't want to change over to this. So I hope that helped you out. If it did, please feel free to leave a comment, like, subscribe, whatever you can. All those sorts of things help the channel out. So until next week, take care, stay safe, have fun with your DIY projects, and I'll see you next Saturday.